Music was meant to exalt God, and even when it doesn't, it is still extremely powerful. For believers, music ought never to be just a sound, it's a spiritual force, and it matters deeply who and what it glorifies. Creativity first. The first revelation we ever have in the Bible of God is that He creates. Before we ever know He is love, we find out that He creates. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we also learn that we are made in His image. So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. To be made in His image means that we share something of His creative propensity. In other words, we are created to create. Creativity isn't a side issue. It's central to how humanity reflects God into the world. And when we neglect creativity, we fail to mirror His nature to a world that desperately needs Him. Music in particular has got a divine calling on it. We see this in Job 38 verse 7, when the angelic realm responds to God's act of creation right in the very beginning. It says, "The morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." So music itself must have existed before the physical world existed. And its primary job was to accompany God's creative work as He made the heavens and the earth. It was as if God's work had its own soundtrack to it. Music opens the heart and the soul. It makes us more receptive and more easily influenced, more open to persuasion. It can lift your mood. It can stir courage in you, it can move you to tears, and it can just as easily soften us to dangerous ideas. As destructive messages and ways of thinking are planted in people's minds, all wrapped up in beautiful melodies. You can see this level of influence in something as innocuous as a TV advert or a film score, where the music is always telling us something, it's telling us how we should feel about what it is that we're seeing. And in this context, every reaction we experience, whether it's physical, spiritual, or emotional, has got a musical reason behind it. 1 Chronicles 25 verse 1 tells us that certain musicians prophesied on their instruments. They didn't just play music, they spoke through it. Music always says something. For example, in 1 Corinthians 14:8, a clear trumpet call signals an army to battle. For if the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to the battle? It's no wonder then that some of the most influential people in the world are musicians. Go and have a look on YouTube and see the most popular videos on there, and you see the overwhelming majority are songs or their musical performances. Music is extremely powerful. Music shapes memory, culture, and destiny. Music is one of the strongest forces for shaping our memory. This is exactly why advertising companies use catchy jingles on all that they're advertising. And you also think of those dear people suffering from dementia, some of whom can still remember and sing songs that they learned in their childhood. And music creates culture. This is why I believe heaven wants to invest into it, and why the enemy tries to resist it in the life of the believer and corrupt it in the world. While there are different schools of thought and interpretations on Ezekiel 28, one of them I think worth looking at is the school of thought where Lucifer actually was like an embodied musical instrument with timbrels and pipes actually built into his body. Ezekiel 28:12-13 says, "You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created." And verse 17, "Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor." Even though he felt the gift remained, and the spirit that sought worship for himself still influences music in the world today. It's no wonder then that those who make music apart from God often attract not only admiration but adoration. It's a kind of a misplaced worship that they were never meant to receive, and that often leads to their destruction. Music was meant to exalt God, and even when it doesn't, it is still extremely powerful. For believers, music ought never to be just a sound, it's a spiritual force, and it matters deeply who and what it glorifies. Our culture has become one where music is about self-glorification, and the TV competition shows and the award ceremonies have led us to believe that we're supposed to judge everyone who sings or plays anything. Music is also a spiritual conduit, and 1 John 1:4 says, "Do not believe every spirit, but test them, because they don't all come from God." In his youth, my younger brother used to attend a music event called Destruction, and you don't need any kind of prophetic insight to see the clue in that name. And after a lifelong struggle with serious addiction and periods of homelessness, we laid him to rest last year. And so you can't tell me that each kind of music and the culture that comes with it and the spiritual source it rises from, they don't carry real power, because they do. I saw the results as I stood alone, miles away from home, in a quiet hospital room where my brother's body lay. As I drove home from the hospital through sobs and tears, I somehow found myself singing. Well, kind of singing. I couldn't really pitch any note at all, to be fair. But I found myself singing the refrain to the song, the great hymn, "How Great Thou Art." You know, in moments of trauma, you never know how you're going to respond. And that day, my heart responded in worship. When my heart was broken, I discovered that my instinct was to lift my voice in praise to my God. Paul ties a spirit-filled life directly to music too, when he says, Ephesians 5:18-19, "Be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing, making melody to the Lord with your heart." And then Colossians 3:16, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God." When we're full of the Spirit and we're full of the Word, a musical overflow toward God is a natural result. Prophetic music. Music and prophetic worship in particular are often linked with God's manifest presence and revelation, and King Saul's encounters are some of the earliest that we come across in the Bible. His first encounters in 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verses 5-13. Before Saul became king, he met a band of prophets who were coming down from a high place. They were playing harps and tambourines, flutes and lyres. And through this meeting, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon Saul, and he began to prophesy, even though he'd never done so ever before. You see, music and the Spirit of God created an atmosphere together where an untrained man was swept up into divine utterance. His second encounter is in 1 Samuel 19, verses 18-24. Which was years later, and Saul was now king, and he was hunting David to kill him. And he'd sent men out to track David down. But when Saul's men entered the prophetic atmosphere where David was, they were overcome by the Spirit of God, and they began to prophesy. So Saul sent more men out, and the same thing happened to them. When they got into that atmosphere, they began to prophesy. So Saul decided to go himself. And the same thing happened. Saul, the king, he ended up prophesying again. Flat, face down on the floor, naked. Music isn't named explicitly on this account, but as it's the same kind of prophetic gathering doing the same kind of things, possibly the same people, there's every chance that they were playing and worshipping in exactly the same way. And you see, when the presence of God turns up, it can turn persecutors into prophets. And even established prophets use music to tune their hearts into God. Take Elisha, for example, in 2 Kings 3:15. He called for a musician to play before the hand of the Lord came upon him, and then he was able to prophesy. Musical keys to biblical truth. And all this isn't just limited to the Old Testament either. The New Testament is full of musical language. For example, in 2 Peter 1, 5-7, he writes, "But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, self-control perseverance, perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love." The word here, add, is a Greek word from which we get our word chorus. So he's not saying to pile on extra duties. He's actually saying to arrange these elements together in your life in harmony, just like you arrange the musical notes in a chord. And we see something similar in Acts 15:15, when it says, "And with this, the words of the prophets agree." The word agree here is the word symphoneo, which is where we get our word symphony, which means an agreement in sound or an agreement in harmony. And it's another musical term. So what exactly are the prophets in this passage agreeing about? Restoring David's tent. The Bible's clear that worship and music are not just support ministries, but they are core to God's vision for his people. In Acts 15:16, James quotes the prophet Amos saying, "And I will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down." Now, this wasn't a random metaphor. David's tabernacle was a 24/7 place of worship, intercession, prophetic ministry, and was staffed full-time with musicians and singers. And God said this is worthy of restoring in the New Testament church to become a worldwide new covenant reality. For 33 years, which is interesting, isn't it? Because it's exactly the same length that Jesus was on the earth, David established continuous prophetic worship in what we now refer to as David's tent or David's tabernacle. Now, these weren't casual volunteers. They were skilled, they were trained, and they knew how to hear God's voice. If we read 1 Chronicles 25:1, David and the commander of the army set apart some of the sons of Asaph, Heman and Jeduthun, who prophesied with lyres, harps, and cymbals. Note that the king himself and the military commanders appointed these musicians. This was of regal and military concern, and appointed by the king, and supported as a priority for the nation. And their leader, Kenaniah, was chosen because he wasn't only a skilled practitioner, but he was able to teach. And that word teach is suggestive of tough discipline and the teaching of technique in order to build up ability. This isn't a hobby, this is serious training. And here David organised 24 teams to worship continually around the Ark of the Presence. And this reflects strongly what we see in Revelation 4 and 5, where 24 elders continually worship around the throne of God. It's also worth noting that this seems to be the point where music and prophetic worship really established itself. Because if you look at the tabernacle that Moses made with Bezalel, it didn't seem to have much music around it. It was more like trumpets were being blown if there was a celebration to be announced, and that seemed to be the limit of it. But if we look at 2 Chronicles 29:25, it says, "And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and stringed instruments and harps, according to the command of David, of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet. For thus was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets." So in light of this, the restoration spoken of in Acts 15 includes not just access to God's presence, but the prominence of prophetic, spirit-led worship, and prominently through music modelled after David's tabernacle. And there was no veil here, there was no separation, unlike the tabernacle of Moses, and worship here was direct, prophetic, continuous, and creative. And this all goes to show that music is not merely performance or entertainment, it's a spiritual weapon and a tool for encounter. It's priestly, frontline work, not merely a nice addition to the preaching or missions. Creativity is apostolic. Music creates and sustains atmospheres. And the kingdom of God is not only proclaimed in words, it's made visible and experienced through its culture. And in this context, creativity in the arts are supposed to carry and establish the culture of the king. For example, when Rome expanded its empire, it did so through architecture, through education, through entertainment, through the arts, through music, so that in any city, when it had been conquered, it already felt like home to a visiting emperor. And in the same way, prophetic worship and music prepares an environment for the King of Kings to feel at home, as he inhabits the praises of his people. Creativity in the arts then should be seen as an apostolic calling because they help shape the environments where the king is both revealed and made welcome. The arts affect culture more deeply and lastingly than laws do. Through creativity, the invisible realities of heaven become visible and experiential, and this draws people to the king by captivating their hearts, not just engaging their minds. So whenever we create in partnership with the Spirit of God, we're not just making Christian art. We are acting as apostolic agents, preparing the earth for the return of the King. A different sound. The world's music often glorifies the performer or wants to spread some form of darkness, but God's raising up a different sound. One that's of a different frequency and from a different spirit. From the moment of creation, through Samuel's musical band of prophets to David and his Levites and his tent, music has always been a conduit for spiritual revelation, and that's why we must pay close attention to what we listen to. If we, as the ecclesia, choose not to honour and support the artists, the musicians, and the prophetic creatives that God wants to raise up, we risk losing them and their gifts to other kingdoms. They will go where they're seen, heard, valued, nurtured, and resourced. But if we release them, if we support them, more of heaven's sound, more of the kingdom of heaven's culture will be seen again on the earth. And this is our choice.